Three men had already told the story of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their accounts, and the Christian communities knew them well. But when the fourth gospel appeared, something was radically different. 90% of its content did not exist in the other three. It did not begin with the birth in Bethlehem. It did not carry the genealogy. The first sentence already declared something that no other evangelist dared to state so directly. And this difference was no accident. It was purpose. To understand why the Gospel of John transformed the history of Christianity, you must first understand who the man behind the text was. And his story begins decades earlier on the shores of a lake in Galilee. John was the son of Zebedee, a fisherman who had businesses prosperous enough to employ workers. The family was not destitute. They owned boats, nets, and a commercial operation that supplied markets in the region. The young John grew up with hands calloused by manual labor, pulling nets that could weigh more than 50 kilograms when full, waking before sunrise to take advantage of the best fishing hours on the Sea of Galilee. This lake was 13 kilometers wide by 21 kilometers long, and its waters harbored more than 20 species of marketable fish. John knew every current, every schooling point, every sign of a storm on the horizon. He had a brother named James. The two were known by a nickname that Jesus himself gave them, Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. The title was not a compliment. It was a description of temperament. Once, when a Samaritan village refused to receive Jesus, John and James suggested that the Master send fire from heaven to consume those people. Jesus' response was a rebuke. The two brothers were impetuous, explosive, full of misdirected zeal. This was the John of the beginning. Not a contemplative mystic, but a hot-blooded young man who wanted to resolve things through force. But something happened over the following 3 years. John became part of Jesus' innermost circle. Only 3 disciples were permitted to witness certain moments: Peter, James, and John. They were there when Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus, a 12-year-old girl whom everyone thought was dead beyond remedy. They ascended the Mount of Transfiguration and saw the face of Christ shine like the sun while Moses and Elijah appeared beside him. They were taken further into the Garden of Gethsemane on the night Jesus sweated drops of blood in agony. John saw what few saw, and this marked him irreversibly. At the Last Supper, John occupied the place of honor. The Jewish tradition of formal meals placed guests reclining on divans, and the place closest to the host was reserved for the most intimate. John was so close to Jesus that he could lean his head against his chest. When Peter wanted to know who the traitor was, he did not ask the Master directly. He signaled for John to ask. The proximity between the two was visible to everyone in the room. Hours later, the world collapsed. Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane. The disciples fled in panic. Mark records that a young man following the group was seized by the guards and escaped naked, leaving the linen cloth that covered him behind. The fear was visceral. Men who promised to die for the Master ran to save their own skins. Peter still tried to follow from a distance, but when he was recognized in the courtyard of the high priest, he denied 3 times that he knew Jesus. Before the rooster crowed, the leader of the apostles had dissolved into tears of shame. John did differently. He went to the cross. The gospel that bears his name records that at the foot of the wood were Mary, the mother of Jesus, her sister, Mary of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, and the disciple whom Jesus loved. This disciple was John. While Roman soldiers divided Christ's clothes by casting lots, while the crowd mocked, while blood flowed from the nails, John remained there. He did not flee, he did not hide. He stayed. Jesus looked down and saw his mother beside the youngest disciple of the group, and in that moment of agony, with failing breath and a yielding body, Christ performed an act of domestic care. He said to Mary, "Woman, behold thy son." And he said to John, "Behold thy mother." From that hour on, John took Mary into his own home. The dying Master entrusted his mother to the only apostle who had the courage to be present. This detail is crucial to understanding the gospel that John would write decades later. Think of the coexistence that followed. Mary lived with John for years, possibly until her death. Every meal was an opportunity to hear stories that no other disciple heard. The angel's annunciation, the visit to Elizabeth, the birth in Bethlehem, the shepherds, the Magi, the flight to Egypt, Simeon and Anna in the temple, the boy Jesus lost in Jerusalem at 12 years old. John had access to decades of memories that Mary kept in her heart. And this explains why his gospel has such a profound theological dimension. He was not just reporting facts, he was processing years of reflection alongside the woman who knew Jesus best. But the Gospel of John was not written immediately after the resurrection. Decades passed. The church grew from 120 people gathered in an upper room in Jerusalem to communities scattered throughout the Roman Empire. Paul made his missionary journeys, planted churches in Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, and reached Rome. Peter preached in Jerusalem, Antioch, and also in the imperial capital. James, John's brother, was the first apostle to be martyred. Herod Agrippa ordered him killed by the sword around the year 44. One by one, the leaders of the first generation were being eliminated. In the year 64, Rome caught fire. Nero needed culprits. The Christians were chosen as the scapegoat. Tacitus, the Roman historian, describes what happened. Followers of Christ were covered with animal skins and torn apart by dogs, others were crucified, still others were turned into human torches to light the imperial gardens at night. Peter was crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same position as his master. Paul, as a Roman citizen, had the privilege of a swifter execution, beheading. In the year 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. Titus's armies besieged the city during Passover, when the population was swollen by pilgrims. It is estimated that more than 1 million people were trapped inside the walls. The siege lasted 5 months. The famine was so severe that there were cases of cannibalism recorded by the historian Josephus. When the Romans finally invaded, the temple was set on fire. That magnificent structure, which had taken 46 years to be renovated by Herod, collapsed in flames. The stones split with the heat. All that remained was the western retaining wall, which to this day the Jews call the Wailing Wall. The world that Jesus knew had disappeared, and John was still alive. At the end of the first century, he was the last survivor. All the other apostles had died. Early church tradition indicates that John settled in Ephesus, one of the largest cities in Asia Minor, with an estimated population of 250,000 people. It was a commercial, religious, and intellectual center. The Temple of Artemis in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, with 127 columns 18 meters high each. The city teemed with ideas, cults, and philosophies. And it was there that John spent his final years leading the Christian community and facing new challenges. Because Christianity at the end of the first century had problems that did not exist at the beginning. Heresies began to emerge. A movement that would later be called Gnosticism was already showing its first forms. The Gnostics taught that matter was evil and spirit was good. Therefore, Jesus could not have had a real physical body. He only appeared to be human. Others questioned whether Jesus was truly divine or just an especially anointed prophet. The communities needed theological clarity, and the 3 existing Gospels, though precious, did not directly answer these questions. Matthew wrote primarily for Jews, showing Jesus as the Messiah promised in the Scriptures. Mark produced a fast-paced, action-oriented account, likely based on Peter's preaching. Luke conducted a careful historical investigation, interviewing witnesses and organizing facts in chronological order. The 3 are called synoptic gospels because they share a similar perspective. In Greek, synoptic means seeing together. They cover many of the same events, sometimes with nearly identical words. John decided to do something completely different. He did not repeat what was already recorded. Of the 8 miracles he narrates, 6 do not appear in the other Gospels. The resurrection of Lazarus, an event so dramatic that it triggered the Sanhedrin's final decision to kill Jesus, is not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Only John tells it. The healing of the man born blind, with all the interrogation that followed, exists only in the 4th Gospel. The turning of water into wine at the wedding at Cana, Jesus' first public sign, is exclusive to John. But the most radical difference is at the beginning. Matthew begins with genealogy, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Mark opens with John the Baptist in the desert, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Luke starts with a formal dedication to Theophilus, explaining his research method, and John does something that none of them did. He goes back to the absolute beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The first sentence of the Gospel of John is one of the densest statements ever written. In Greek, word is logos, a term that carried centuries of philosophical weight. For the Greeks, logos meant reason, logic, the ordering principle of the universe. For the Jews, the Word of God was the agent of creation. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. John took this concept and made an explosive assertion. The Logos was not just an abstract principle. The Logos was a person. And this person was with God since before the creation of the world. Not only was he with God, he was God. John's prologue continues for 18 verses, and each sentence adds a layer of meaning. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. The Word is not a creature. He is the Creator. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The source of all biological and spiritual existence lies in this eternal Word. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There is a cosmic conflict underway, and the light prevails. Then comes the verse that changes everything. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us. This sentence was scandalous to Greeks and Jews alike. To the Greek mind, matter was inferior, corrupt, unworthy of the divine. The idea that the eternal Logos could become human flesh was repugnant. To the Jews, God was transcendent, totally other, separated from creation by an infinite abyss of holiness. The notion that he could dwell among us, literally pitch his tent among us, using the same language as the tabernacle in the desert, was almost blasphemy. John knew exactly what he was doing. He was not writing for people who already agreed with him. He was building an argument for a diverse, sophisticated audience full of objections, and his strategy was audacious. Instead of diluting the message to make it more palatable, he intensified it. The first sentence of his gospel already answers the question the Gnostics would ask: is Jesus truly divine? Yes, he is the eternal Word who was with God and was God from the beginning. And it also answers the opposite objection: is Jesus truly human? Yes, the Word became flesh, real flesh, not the appearance of flesh. But John did not stop at the prologue. Throughout 21 chapters, he builds a portrait of Jesus that exists nowhere else. The famous I am statements of Jesus appear primarily in this gospel. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. Each of these declarations is a claim of divinity, because I am was the name God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. When Jesus told the Jewish leaders, "Before Abraham was, I am," they took up stones to stone him. They understood perfectly what he was saying. It was not bad grammar, it was explosive theology. John also records the longest and deepest dialogues of Jesus. The conversation with Nicodemus about the new birth occupies an entire chapter. The encounter with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well reveals layers of meaning about worship, living water, and the true identity of the Messiah. The farewell discourses in chapters 13 to 17 contain the most intimate words Jesus spoke to his disciples: promises about the Holy Spirit, teachings on abiding in him, the high priestly prayer in which Jesus intercedes for those who believe. No other gospel has this material. The explanation is that John lived longer, reflected more deeply, and had access to memories that others did not. He was present in private moments. He heard conversations that did not happen before the crowds. And he spent decades processing the meaning of all this, especially during the years he cared for Mary. But there was also a factor of urgency. John was old, very old by the standards of the time. Life expectancy in the 1st century revolved around 35 years. Reaching 60 was already remarkable. John passed 90. He knew his time was running out, and he knew that when he died, the last direct connection to Jesus would disappear. No one else could say, "I saw with my own eyes, I touched with my own hands." The generation of eyewitnesses was coming to an end. The apostle carried this weight. In his letters, John makes a point of emphasizing sensory testimony. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled. That which we have seen and heard, declare we unto you. He was not transmitting rumors. He was not passing on third-hand traditions. He was declaring what his own senses had captured. And he wanted future generations to know that the Christian faith was based on real events, witnessed by real people who risked their lives to tell what they knew to be true. The cost was immense. Early Christian tradition records that John was the only apostle who did not die as a martyr. But that does not mean he escaped suffering. Tertullian, a 2nd century writer, mentions that John was taken to Rome and plunged into boiling oil, but miraculously survived. Truth or legend, the fact is that John was exiled to Patmos, a rocky island in the Aegean Sea, with an area of only 34 square kilometers. It was a place of banishment for political prisoners. There, isolated from his community, John received the visions that would become the Book of Revelation. Imagine the scene. A 90-year-old man, alone on a barren island, separated from everything and everyone he loved. He had seen Peter die. He had seen James, his own brother, beheaded. He had seen Jerusalem burn. He had seen the temple turn to ashes. And now he was there, exiled, probably waiting for his own death to arrive at any moment. It was in this context that he decided to write. The Gospel of John was likely finalized in Ephesus after the apostle returned from exile. Some scholars date the composition between the years 85 and 90, others extend it to 95. Regardless, it was one of the last books of the New Testament to be written. John had the benefit of decades of reflection, of seeing how the church developed, of identifying which questions needed to be answered, of perceiving which aspects of Jesus' life deserved special emphasis. And he made deliberate choices. John selected only 7 miracles to narrate, which he calls signs. Each sign reveals something specific about who Jesus is. The water turned into wine shows Jesus as the one who brings joy and abundance. The healing of the official's son demonstrates that Jesus' word has authority even at a distance. The paralytic at Bethesda, healed after 38 years, reveals Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath. The multiplication of the loaves presents Jesus as the true bread that comes down from heaven. The walking on the water shows his dominion over nature. The man born blind manifests Jesus as the light of the world. And the resurrection of Lazarus, the 7th and greatest sign, declares that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. 7 signs. 7 I am declarations. The number 7, in the Jewish mindset, represented completeness, perfection. John was building a complete portrait of Christ. The Gospel also has a significant geographical structure. Jesus travels repeatedly between Galilee and Jerusalem, participating in various Jewish feasts. Passover appears 3 times, which allows for the calculation that Jesus' public ministry lasted approximately 3 years. The synoptics may give the impression of a shorter ministry, concentrated in Galilee with a single final trip to Jerusalem. John corrects this perspective, showing a Jesus who regularly frequented the temple and taught in the capital. There is also a unique emphasis on the humanity of Jesus. It may seem contradictory. John is the gospel that most clearly affirms the divinity of Christ. But it is also the only one that shows Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus. It is the only one that records Jesus asking the Samaritan woman for water because he was weary from the journey. It is the only one that describes Jesus bending down to wash the disciples' feet, doing the work of a slave. John maintains the tension, fully God, fully man, the eternal Word who feels thirst. This combination was revolutionary. The heresies that would emerge in the following centuries almost always erred on one of these points. Some denied the divinity of Jesus, others denied his humanity. John closed both doors. His gospel became the Church's most important theological weapon to combat distortions of the faith. When the ecumenical councils met to define the doctrine of Christ, the formulations that emerged, true God of true God, who for us and for our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate, echoed Johannine language directly. The impact was immediate and lasting. Papyri containing fragments of the Gospel of John were found in Egypt and dated to the beginning of the 2nd century. The so-called P52 papyrus, preserved in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, contains a few verses from the 18th chapter of John and is considered the oldest manuscript of any New Testament text. This means that, only a few decades after being written, the Gospel was already circulating more than 1,000 kilometers from where it was composed. The message was spreading with remarkable speed for an era without the printing press, without the internet, without any communication technology beyond copyists working by candlelight. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around the year 180, already considered the 4 Gospels as a fixed and authoritative set. He argued that just as there are 4 regions of the world and 4 principal winds, there should be 4 Gospels, no more, no less. This defense may seem strange today, but it shows that less than a century after John's death, his gospel already held unquestionable canonical status in the major Christian communities. The following centuries only increased this influence. Augustine, in the 4th century, said that the Gospel of John was so deep that a child could wade in it without drowning, but an elephant could swim in it without touching the bottom. The image captures the reality. The text is accessible enough for a new convert to find salvation, but deep enough for theologians to spend a lifetime studying without exhausting its meaning. The prologue alone generated entire libraries of commentaries. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest medieval theologian, wrote an extensive commentary on John and considered this gospel the highest point of biblical revelation. The Christian mystical tradition, whether Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, drank abundantly from this source. When the Reformers wanted to emphasize salvation by grace through faith, it was to John they turned. For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. John 3, verse 16. Probably the most memorized verse in the Bible. And it all began with a fisherman who decided not to flee from the cross. This is the part that cannot be forgotten. John was not an armchair theologian. He was not a philosopher speculating on the divine from abstract concepts. He was a man who touched the resurrected body of Jesus, who placed his finger in the nail marks, who saw the side pierced by the spear. When he writes that the Word became flesh, he is speaking of flesh that he embraced. When he states that they saw the glory of the only begotten of the Father, he is describing what his own eyes witnessed on the Mount of Transfiguration. The Gospel of John is not theory, it is testimony. And this testimony cost dearly. John lost his brother to Herod's sword. He lost Peter and Paul to Nero's cruelty. He lost his hometown when the Romans razed Jerusalem. He lost decades of life in exile or in the leadership of a persecuted community. What did he gain in return? The certainty that he was telling the truth, the conviction that the world needed to know who Jesus really was, and the hope that even after his voice fell silent, his words would continue to speak. They continue to this day. The Gospel of John has been translated into more than 2,000 languages. It is read in Gothic cathedrals and thatched huts, in megacities and remote villages, in hospitals and prisons, in moments of celebration and mourning. When someone is dying and a chaplain is called, it is frequently John 14 that he reads, "Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions." When a couple marries, the account of Cana is often mentioned, where Jesus turned water into wine and blessed a wedding feast with his presence. When someone wants to understand the love of God, it is John 3:16 that comes to mind. The influence extends beyond the religious. The phrase, "in the beginning was the Word," has echoed in literature, philosophy, and art for 2 millennia. Goethe, in Faust, has his protagonist attempt to translate this phrase and struggle with its meaning. Renaissance artists depicted scenes exclusive to John: the resurrection of Lazarus, the Samaritan woman, the washing of the feet, in works that defined the visual culture of the West. The eagle, the symbol of John because his gospel flies higher than the others, appears in countless churches, coats of arms, and artistic representations. None of this would exist if an old man in Ephesus had not decided to write. John did not just write a biography. He constructed a theological document that would answer the most important question in human history: who is Jesus of Nazareth? While the other Gospels showed what Jesus did, John revealed who Jesus is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. With this single sentence, the fisherman from Bethsaida established the doctrine that would sustain Christianity for the next 2,000 years. Today, when a Christian affirms that Jesus is God, he is echoing the words of a man who touched the Master's hands, who leaned his head against his chest at the Last Supper, who stood at the foot of the cross when all others fled. John did not write theory. He wrote testimony. And this testimony crossed empires, survived persecutions, resisted heresies, and reached you intact. John himself explained why he wrote, "But these are written, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name." 2,000 years later, the invitation remains open.